For more than a century, the United States dollar stood at the center of the global financial system, quietly powerful, widely trusted, and seemingly unbreakable. It was not just a currency, it was a symbol of stability, authority, and economic dominance. Nations traded in it, banks stored it, and governments depended on it. The world did not merely use the dollar, it believed in it. And belief, more than gold or oil, was the true foundation of its strength. At the heart of this system stood the Federal Reserve, an institution designed to safeguard monetary stability, manage inflation, and act as the lender of last resort. For decades, the Federal Reserve reassured markets that it had the tools, expertise, and discipline to prevent catastrophe. Interest rates were adjusted, liquidity was injected, and crises were smoothed over with carefully worded statements. Each time the system trembled, confidence was restored, at least on the surface, but beneath that surface, cracks were forming. The modern dollar was no longer backed by gold, silver, or any physical asset. Since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s, the dollar had become a fiat currency, its value derived solely from trust in government decree. When President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, it granted unprecedented flexibility to policymakers. Money could now be created digitally, infinitely scalable, unconstrained by physical reserves. What began as a temporary measure quietly became permanent doctrine. For a while, it worked, the U.S. economy expanded, markets boomed, and consumer culture exploded. Debt became normal, then encouraged. Households borrowed, corporations leveraged, and governments ran deficits with little fear of consequence. Each crisis was met with the same solution: print more money, lower rates, stimulate demand. The system learned that pain could be postponed, even if it could not be eliminated. By the early 21st century, the dollar's dominance reached historic levels. Oil was priced in dollars. International loans were issued in dollars. Even rival nations stockpiled dollars to stabilize their own currencies. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund reinforced its central role, while global trade systems made alternatives impractical. The dollar was no longer just America's currency, it was the world's operating system, yet every system built on perpetual growth faces one unavoidable question: what happens when growth stops? The warning signs were subtle at first. Rising national debt numbers were dismissed as abstract figures. Trillions became just another unit of measurement, stripped of meaning. Political leaders reassured citizens that deficits don't matter, while economists argued that a sovereign issuer of currency could never truly go broke. After all, the U.S. could always print more dollars. The assumption was simple and fatal: demand for the dollar would last forever. Then came the era of shocks. Financial crises no longer occurred once in a generation, they became routine. Market crashes, global pandemics, supply chain breakdowns, and geopolitical conflicts forced unprecedented intervention. Trillions of dollars were injected into the economy within months. Balance sheets exploded. Interest rates were pinned near zero for years, distorting risk and rewarding speculation over productivity. Asset prices soared, but wages lagged behind. Inequality widened. Inflation, once considered defeated, returned quietly, then all at once. Everyday goods became more expensive, while official statements insisted the situation was transitory. Trust began to erode, not with panic, but with confusion. Internationally, cracks widened further. Rival powers questioned why global trade should remain dependent on a single nation's currency. Bilateral agreements emerged that bypassed the dollar entirely. Gold purchases by central banks surged. Digital alternatives and decentralized assets like Bitcoin, once dismissed as experiments, were suddenly taken seriously as hedges against systemic risk. The world was changing, but the dollar system remained rigid. At home, political paralysis made decisive reform impossible. Every solution carried short-term pain, and pain was politically unacceptable. So the can was kicked further down the road. More debt. More stimulus. More reassurances. The public was told the system was resilient, that collapse was impossible, that the dollar had survived worse. History, however, tells a different story. No currency collapses overnight. It weakens slowly, then suddenly. First comes denial. Then distortion. Finally, panic. By the time confidence truly breaks, it is already too late to reverse course. The dollar's greatest strength, global belief, was also its greatest vulnerability, because once belief disappears, numbers on a screen mean nothing, and by the time the world realized the dollar was no longer a safe haven, the countdown had already begun. For decades, debt was treated as a tool, something to be managed, balanced, and occasionally feared. But slowly, almost invisibly, it transformed into a dependency. By the time anyone thought to ask whether the United States could survive without borrowing, the system no longer had a choice. The numbers alone were staggering. Trillions in national debt became tens of trillions, and then figures so large they lost emotional meaning. The United States Treasury issued bonds at a pace never before seen in history, confident that global demand would never dry up. After all, U.S. government debt was considered the safest asset on Earth, backed by the world's strongest economy and its reserve currency. But safety, like trust, is fragile. Every year, Congress raised the debt ceiling, turning what should have been an emergency measure into political theater. Lawmakers argued fiercely on camera, yet always reached the same conclusion behind closed doors: default was unthinkable. The consequences were too severe. Global markets would panic. The dollar would weaken. Confidence would shatter. So the borrowing continued. At first, debt funded growth. Infrastructure, defense, innovation, these were investments with visible returns. But gradually, debt began financing debt itself. New bonds were issued not to build the future, but to pay interest on the past. The system had crossed a line. It was no longer borrowing to expand, it was borrowing to survive. This was the essence of the debt trap. Low interest rates masked the danger. With borrowing costs near zero, debt appeared cheap, almost free. Economists reassured policymakers that inflation was under control and that markets could absorb unlimited issuance. Central banks, including the Federal Reserve, stepped in as silent buyers, purchasing government bonds with newly created money, a process known as quantitative easing. On paper, it stabilized the system. In reality, it rewired it. Private investors began to retreat. Pension funds, foreign governments, and institutional buyers quietly reduced their exposure. Why accept low returns on bonds when inflation was eroding their real value? To fill the gap, the Federal Reserve became the buyer of last resort, then the buyer of first resort. The line between government spending and money creation blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, household debt exploded. Americans relied increasingly on credit cards, auto loans, student debt, and mortgages to maintain their standard of living. Wages failed to keep pace with rising costs, forcing families to borrow simply to stay afloat. What once financed opportunity now financed survival. The same pattern repeating at the national level was playing out in millions of homes. The illusion held, until inflation returned. As prices rose, interest rates followed. Servicing debt became dramatically more expensive. Each percentage point increase translated into hundreds of billions of dollars in additional interest payments for the government alone. Suddenly, debt was no longer abstract, it was suffocating. Foreign creditors took notice. Countries that once eagerly bought U.S. bonds began to question the long-term sustainability of American finances. Why lend to a nation that could only repay by issuing more debt? Why hold assets denominated in a currency losing purchasing power year after year? Some began diversifying into gold. Others turned to regional trade agreements that bypassed the dollar entirely. Confidence didn't vanish overnight, it leaked out slowly. Credit rating agencies issued warnings. Financial commentators used softer language: fiscal imbalance, structural risk, long-term uncertainty. But markets understand subtext. Bond yields crept upward. Demand weakened. For the first time in generations, U.S. debt needed incentives to attract buyers. The government responded the only way it knew how: more borrowing. Short-term bills replaced long-term bonds, reducing immediate costs but increasing rollover risk. Every few months, trillions in debt needed refinancing. The system became hypersensitive to market sentiment. A single failed auction, a single spike in yields, could trigger catastrophe. Behind closed doors, emergency plans were drawn up. Capital controls were discussed. Extraordinary measures became routine. Publicly, leaders insisted everything was under control. Privately, they understood the truth: the United States was no longer in control of its debt, the debt was in control of the United States. History had seen this pattern before. Empires rarely collapse from invasion alone. More often, they collapse under the weight of their own obligations. Rome debased its currency to fund its armies. Modern states printed money to fund promises they could no longer keep. The symptoms were always the same: rising prices, social unrest, and the slow erosion of trust. By the time the debt trap fully closed, escape was impossible without immense pain. Cut spending? The economy would crash. Raise taxes? Political rebellion. Default? Global financial meltdown. Print more money? Inflation spirals further. Every option led to collapse, just on different timelines. The dollar, once the anchor of the global economy, was now chained to an ever-growing mountain of promises. And as history would soon prove, promises backed only by faith eventually demand payment. The question was no longer if the system would break, it was who would pay the price when it did. Inflation rarely announces itself as a disaster. It arrives quietly, disguised as inconvenience. A few cents more for fuel. Slightly higher grocery bills. Rent increases explained away as market adjustments. At first, people adapt. They always do. But when inflation accelerates, adaptation turns into desperation. For years, policymakers insisted inflation was under control. Central banks had studied it, modeled it, tamed it, or so they believed. When prices first began to rise sharply, the explanation was simple: supply chain disruptions, temporary shortages, global uncertainty. The public was told to be patient. The word transitory became a mantra. It was a fatal miscalculation. The flood of money injected during years of crisis had not disappeared, it had only been dormant. Once velocity returned, prices responded violently. Too many dollars were now chasing too few goods. Inflation was no longer a statistic, it was a lived experience. Every receipt became evidence. Every paycheck felt smaller than the last. The Federal Reserve faced an impossible dilemma. Raise interest rates aggressively, and risk collapsing debt markets already stretched to the limit. Hold rates low, and allow inflation to devour purchasing power. Either choice would destroy confidence. The era of painless solutions was over. As inflation crossed critical thresholds, expectations shifted. This was the turning point. Once people expect prices to rise, behavior changes. Consumers rushed to buy before costs increased again. Businesses raised prices preemptively. Workers demanded higher wages, not to get ahead, but just to survive. The cycle fed itself. Currency, by definition, is a store of value. Inflation attacked that foundation directly. Savings accounts lost real value by the month. Retirement plans shrank in purchasing power. Decades of careful planning evaporated quietly, without a single market crash. Those on fixed incomes suffered first and worst. The elderly, the poor, and the middle class watched their financial security dissolve in real time. Trust in official data collapsed soon after. Government inflation numbers lagged reality. They were based on weighted baskets and outdated assumptions. People didn't need charts, they needed groceries. When official statements contradicted lived experience, credibility vanished. A nation that no longer trusts its numbers no longer trusts its currency. Businesses began breaking under pressure. Small companies couldn't adjust prices fast enough to cover rising input costs. Supply contracts collapsed. Long-term planning became impossible. Why sign a year-long deal when prices could double in 6 months? Entire sectors shifted to short-term survival mode, sacrificing efficiency and growth. The labor market fractured, wage negotiations turned hostile. Strikes spread. Employers, already burdened by higher financing costs, laid off workers or automated aggressively. Unemployment rose even as prices climbed, a toxic combination once thought impossible. The economic models no longer worked. Reality had escaped the spreadsheet. Globally, inflation shattered the dollar's final illusion, stability. Foreign governments holding U.S. reserves watched their purchasing power erode. Trillions in dollar-denominated assets lost value in real terms. Some tried to exit quietly, selling bonds and converting reserves into commodities, gold, or alternative currencies. Others hesitated, fearful of triggering the very collapse they were trying to avoid, but exits always accelerate once they begin. Imports became dramatically more expensive. Energy prices surged. Food inflation sparked protests. The dollar, once a shield, now transmitted inflation worldwide. Allies questioned why they should continue absorbing the consequences of America's monetary decisions. At home, people adapted in dangerous ways. Cash was spent immediately, never saved. Hard assets, gold, property, collectibles, became stores of value. Informal barter networks emerged in struggling communities. The idea of money as a reliable measuring tool was breaking down. When money loses meaning, society loses coordination. Central banks attempted control, interest rates were raised in emergency meetings. Markets reacted violently. Stock prices collapsed. Bond markets froze. The cost of servicing national debt exploded overnight. Each intervention solved one problem by igniting another. Policy had become firefighting, never prevention. Historical comparisons grew unavoidable. Germany in the 1920s. Latin America in the 1980s. More recently, countries that dismissed inflation warnings until it was too late. Every case followed the same psychological path: denial, justification, normalization, then panic. The United States had believed itself immune. It was not. By the time inflation reached double digits, the damage was irreversible. Confidence, the last pillar of the dollar, was collapsing. Money only functions because people believe it will be accepted tomorrow at roughly the same value as today. That belief was now broken. And once broken, it cannot be legislated back into existence. The dollar was still circulating. Prices were still quoted. Salaries were still paid, but in the minds of millions, the question had already changed. Not how much does it cost, but how fast will it cost more? And when a nation starts asking that question, the end is no longer theoretical. It is inevitable. The collapse of the dollar did not begin inside the United States. It began outside it. For decades, the world tolerated America's monetary excesses because the dollar offered something no alternative could: liquidity, stability, and universal acceptance. Even when inflation rose and debt ballooned, foreign governments stayed invested, not out of loyalty, but necessity. The global system had been designed around the dollar, and exiting it carried enormous risk, but inflation changed the calculation. As the dollar's purchasing power eroded, foreign central banks realized they were paying the price for decisions they did not control. Every new round of money creation diluted their reserves. Every policy mistake in Washington echoed through their economies. The question was no longer whether the dollar was convenient, but whether it was dangerous. Quietly, the exodus began. Central banks reduced exposure in small increments, careful not to spook markets. Treasury bonds were allowed to mature without reinvestment. Dollar reserves were diversified into other currencies and hard assets. Gold, dismissed for decades as a relic, returned to prominence. Vaults filled. Shipments increased. Trust shifted from promises to physical weight. At the center of this shift was the growing movement known as de-dollarization. Major economies explored bilateral trade agreements that bypassed the dollar entirely. Energy deals were settled in local currencies. Regional payment systems were expanded to avoid reliance on U.S.-controlled financial infrastructure. What once seemed unthinkable became policy. The BRICS bloc accelerated efforts to reduce dependence on the dollar, framing it as economic sovereignty rather than rebellion. For them, this was not ideology, it was survival. Why should their growth be constrained by another nation's debt cycle? Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund issued increasingly cautious statements. Official language remained diplomatic, but the message was clear: global imbalances were reaching dangerous levels. Confidence in the reserve currency system was weakening. Stability could no longer be assumed. Markets felt it immediately. Demand for U.S. bonds softened. Auctions required higher yields to attract buyers. The cost of financing America's debt rose sharply, feeding back into inflation and deficit pressures. What had once been a privilege, issuing the world's reserve currency, was becoming a liability. Trade patterns shifted, exporters demanded payment in currencies less exposed to U.S. inflation. Importers hedged aggressively against dollar volatility. Multinational corporations restructured supply chains to minimize dollar exposure. Even allies began quietly preparing contingency plans. This was not a coordinated rebellion. It was something far more dangerous: rational self-interest. Currency dominance depends on network effects. The more people use a currency, the more valuable it becomes. But once alternatives reach critical mass, reversals happen quickly. Every country that exits reduces the incentive for others to stay. Momentum flips. Inside the United States, the consequences were swift. A weaker dollar meant higher import prices: fuel, electronics, medicine, food. Inflation surged again, this time driven externally. Interest rate hikes failed to stabilize the currency. Instead, they crushed domestic investment while doing little to restore global confidence. The Federal Reserve found itself isolated. For decades, its policies shaped global liquidity. Now, global markets were shaping it. Foreign selling of dollar assets forced emergency interventions. Swap lines were reopened. Diplomatic pressure intensified. But trust, once lost, does not return through negotiation. Even the concept of safe haven collapsed. During past crises, investors fled to the dollar. This time, they fled from it. Capital sought refuge in commodities, alternative currencies, and non-dollar denominated assets. The psychological shift was complete. History offered chilling parallels. The British pound once dominated global trade, backed by empire and naval power. When debt, war, and inflation eroded confidence, its decline was slow, but irreversible. The United States had believed itself different. Exceptional. Indispensable. The world disagreed. By the time headlines openly questioned the dollar's reserve status, the decision had already been made. Reserve currencies do not die in speeches or summits. They die in spreadsheets, balance sheets, and quiet reallocations. And as the global system rewired itself, one truth became unavoidable: the United States could print dollars. But it could not print global trust. The exodus was no longer gradual, it was accelerating. You only feel it when it's gone. For generations, Americans trusted the dollar without question. They accepted it for labor, saved it for the future, and measured their lives through it. Even during recessions and market crashes, the belief remained: the dollar would endure. That belief was stronger than policy, stronger than data, stronger than reality, until it wasn't. The collapse of confidence did not begin with a single announcement or catastrophic headline. It began with behavior. People started moving faster, spending sooner, converting wages into assets the moment they were paid. Saving, once considered responsible, now felt reckless. Banks noticed first. Deposits began to fall as customers withdrew funds, not out of panic, but strategy. Why leave money in an account losing value every month? Why trust institutions exposed to collapsing bond markets? What started as precaution soon became acceleration. Then came the runs. Images of long lines outside banks spread across social media. Official statements insisted the system was sound, that deposits were safe, that liquidity was ample. But history had taught people a hard lesson: when reassurance becomes loud, danger is close. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation raised coverage limits and issued guarantees. The Federal Reserve opened emergency lending facilities. Trillions were promised overnight. But promises only work when belief still exists. This time, belief was fading. Markets reacted violently. Stocks plunged as investors fled anything tied to domestic demand. Bonds collapsed as yields spiked uncontrollably. Pension funds, once considered conservative, found themselves insolvent as long-term assets lost value faster than models predicted. Retirement, for millions, became an uncertainty rather than a milestone. The media tried to contain the narrative. Phrases like temporary volatility and confidence shock dominated coverage. But people didn't need analysts. They had receipts, bank apps, and empty ATMs. The disconnect between official language and lived reality became impossible to ignore. Businesses shifted into survival mode, cash flow mattered more than growth. Prices were adjusted daily. Employees were paid faster, sometimes weekly or even daily, because tomorrow's dollar was worth less than today's. Long-term contracts disappeared. Planning horizons collapsed from years to weeks. The dollar's role as a measuring stick was gone. When money can't measure value reliably, everything becomes unstable. Investment freezes. Innovation slows. Risk-taking turns reckless. The economy no longer moves forward, it oscillates violently. Trust in institutions followed the currency downward. Political polarization intensified. Every decision was framed as betrayal. Emergency powers expanded. Capital controls were debated openly. Restrictions on withdrawals, transfers, and foreign exchange were justified as temporary stability measures. They never felt temporary. International investors pulled out completely. Foreign capital, once the backbone of U.S. financial markets, vanished. Real estate prices collapsed. Stock exchanges became casinos dominated by algorithms and speculators. The idea of America as a safe place to park wealth was over. History's warnings echoed loudly now. Currency collapse is not just economic, it is psychological. Once people believe money will fail, they act in ways that guarantee it will. Hoarding. Flight. Substitution. The system becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The government faced an impossible choice: allow markets to purge themselves and risk total collapse, or intervene further and destroy what little confidence remained. IT chose intervention. Emergency laws froze certain transactions. Banks were consolidated. Failing institutions were absorbed overnight. The distinction between public and private finance dissolved entirely. Money creation became explicit, no longer hidden behind complex mechanisms. The dollar was still legal tender, but it was no longer trusted. By this point, the question Americans asked was no longer whether the dollar would recover. It was how long it would take to fail completely. Confidence, once broken, does not return in stages. It disappears all at once. And with it went the last pillar holding the dollar upright. When confidence collapses, governments act fast, or not at all. And when they act fast, they rarely ask for permission. As the dollar's credibility disintegrated, policymakers faced a nightmare scenario: a modern economy attempting to function without trust in its own money. Markets no longer responded to interest rates. Public statements no longer calmed nerves. The traditional levers of control had snapped. So the government reached for extraordinary power. The first measures were framed as technical safeguards. Temporary limits on cash withdrawals. Delays on large wire transfers. Enhanced reporting requirements for foreign exchange transactions. Officials emphasized the word temporary again and again. But people understood what history had taught them: emergency controls, once imposed, are rarely reversed. Banks became extensions of the state overnight. Under coordination with the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury, financial institutions were ordered to prioritize system stability over customer demand. Accounts were flagged. Transfers were queued. Liquidity was rationed. What had once been private money now felt conditional. Capital controls followed. Limits were placed on converting dollars into foreign currencies. Overseas investments required approval. Corporations were pressured to repatriate profits. Individuals attempting to move savings abroad discovered their transactions frozen, reversed, or delayed indefinitely. The message was clear: money could still move, but only where authorities allowed it. Public reaction was swift and polarized. Some welcomed the controls, believing strong action was necessary to prevent total collapse. Others saw them for what they were: a tacit admission that the dollar could no longer stand on its own. Protests erupted. Legal challenges were filed. But courts move slowly, and crises do not wait. Digital oversight expanded rapidly. To enforce controls at scale, surveillance was automated. Transactions were monitored in real time. Spending patterns were analyzed for risk behavior. Financial privacy, once assumed, quietly disappeared. The system justified itself as protection against speculation and capital flight. In parallel, a new solution was introduced: a state-backed digital currency, marketed as modernization, was rushed forward as a replacement for failing cash infrastructure. Officials promised efficiency, transparency, and stability. In practice, it offered something else entirely: absolute control over money's movement. Every unit could be tracked. Every transaction could be approved, or denied. Every wallet could be frozen with a keystroke. The public was told adoption was optional, IT wasn't. Businesses were required to accept the digital currency for taxes and payroll. Benefits were distributed exclusively through it. Gradually, cash became scarce, then irrelevant. The transition was not announced, it simply happened. Economic life narrowed, informal markets were criminalized. Barter was discouraged. Gold transactions were restricted. Anything outside the monitored system was labeled destabilizing. Stability, the government argued, required uniform compliance. Meanwhile, inflation did not stop. Controls slowed panic but strangled productivity. Supply shortages worsened. Black markets flourished. Enforcement costs ballooned. The state found itself policing behavior it could not economically support. Internationally, the response was brutal. Foreign partners rejected the new system outright. Trade contracted. Investment collapsed. Sanctions, once a tool of U.S. power, were now mirrored back. The dollar's isolation was complete. Historically, this was the point of no return. Emergency powers change incentives. Leaders stop asking what works and start asking what maintains control. Policy becomes defensive. Transparency disappears. Data is managed. Narratives harden. The currency was still circulating, but only by force. Money, stripped of trust and choice, becomes a token of compliance rather than exchange. And compliance is fragile. It holds only as long as enforcement does. As shortages spread and resentment grew, the public understood the truth no official would say aloud: the government had saved the system by destroying it. The dollar no longer failed because people didn't believe in IT. IT failed because belief was no longer required, and when money survives only through coercion, its end is already written. Economic collapse is often described in charts and numbers, but its true impact is written on faces, homes, and streets. By the time the dollar lost its function as reliable money, the damage had already moved beyond banks and markets. It had entered daily life. What had once been abstract, monetary policy, inflation targets, reserve status, now determined who ate, who worked, and who waited. The first fracture appeared in consumption. Supermarket shelves thinned. Not because food no longer existed, but because pricing it had become impossible. Suppliers refused contracts. Trucking companies demanded advance payment. Retailers shortened hours to avoid losses from overnight price swings. What remained on shelves was expensive, inconsistent, and rationed. For the first time in generations, Americans queued for essentials. Informal rationing emerged before official policy did. Stores limited quantities. Pharmacies locked up medicine. Fuel stations closed unpredictably. People learned to arrive early, to trade favors, to rely on word of mouth rather than advertisements. Communities adapted, but not equally. Those with land grew food. Those with skills traded services. Those with assets survived longer. But millions had nothing to trade. Fixed incomes became death sentences. Welfare systems, overwhelmed and underfunded, collapsed under demand. The middle class fractured next. Careers built over decades evaporated in months. Professionals found their salaries meaningless against rising costs. Savings were gone. Pensions frozen. The social contract, work hard, plan carefully, retire safely, was revealed as a myth dependent on stable money. Crime followed predictably. Theft rose first. Then organized black markets. Then violence. Not ideological violence, but economic violence. Desperation breeds efficiency. Law enforcement, underpaid and understaffed, struggled to respond. Some areas adapted with local protection. Others descended into chaos. Trust between citizens eroded. Money had once mediated exchange impersonally. Without it, every transaction became personal and risky. Who could be trusted? Who was hoarding? Who had access? Suspicion replaced cooperation. communities became insular. Outsiders were viewed as threats, political identity hardened into survival identity, debates about policy vanished. Only outcomes mattered. Leaders were judged not by ideology, but by whether people ate that week. Protests multiplied, not for reform, but for relief. When relief failed to arrive, protests turned destructive. The United States Congress passed emergency social measures, but funding lagged inflation. Aid lost value before distribution. What arrived was symbolic rather than stabilizing. Confidence in governance collapsed alongside the currency, education systems faltered, teachers left. Schools shortened schedules. Children were pulled out to help families survive. A generation's future quietly narrowed, not through policy, but necessity. Healthcare fractured dangerously, hospitals demanded upfront payment. Supplies ran short. Skilled workers emigrated where possible. Preventable conditions became fatal. Life expectancy dropped, not from war or plague, but from economic dysfunction. At this stage, the collapse became self-sustaining. A society without reliable money cannot coordinate labor, distribute resources efficiently, or plan for the future. Productivity collapses not because people stop working, but because work no longer translates into security. Historically, this phase determines everything. Some nations fracture permanently. Others rebuild, slowly, painfully, around new systems of value. But rebuilding requires something rarer than capital, collective belief in a shared future. In the United States, that belief was fading. The dollar still existed in name. Digital balances still appeared on screens. Wages were still paid, but none of it meant what it once did. People no longer asked about inflation rates or monetary policy, they asked simpler, older questions. Who has food? Who has power? Who can be trusted? When a society asks those questions, money has already failed, and when money fails, everything it once held together begins to come apart. Default is a word governments avoid at all costs. It signals failure, not just to pay, but to promise. For years, U.S. officials insisted default was impossible. The nation issued debt in its own currency. It controlled the printing press. It could always meet its obligations, at least nominally. That argument held as long as money retained meaning, but when the dollar lost trust, repayment became symbolic. The crisis reached its climax during a routine debt rollover. Trillions in short-term obligations came due. Under normal conditions, refinancing would have been automatic. This time, demand evaporated. Bond auctions failed or cleared only at yields so high they threatened immediate insolvency. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings stretched through the night. The United States Treasury faced an impossible arithmetic. Servicing existing debt required issuing new debt, at interest rates that exploded daily. Printing more money would accelerate inflation beyond control. Cutting spending would paralyze a society already at the breaking point. There was no path left that preserved credibility. At dawn, the announcement was made: the United States would temporarily suspend certain debt payments while restructuring obligations. The language was careful, legal, sanitized. But markets understood immediately this was a default. Credit rating agencies responded within hours. Downgrades followed, swift and brutal. Assets once labeled risk-free were reclassified overnight. Global financial institutions marked down trillions in losses. Balance sheets shattered, markets around the world halted trading, stock exchanges triggered circuit breakers repeatedly. Bond markets froze completely. Derivatives tied to U.S. debt imploded, dragging down institutions that had never imagined they were exposed. The interconnected system unraveled faster than any model had predicted. The psychological impact was catastrophic. If U.S. treasuries were no longer safe, nothing was. The foundational assumption of modern finance, that there exists a truly risk-free asset, was gone. Every valuation had to be reconsidered. Every portfolio rewritten. Inside the United States, the reaction was raw, public outrage mixed with exhaustion. For many, the announcement changed nothing, they were already living in default conditions. For others, it marked the final betrayal. Savings tied to government bonds evaporated. Pension guarantees vanished. Insurance promises became meaningless, the Federal Reserve attempted damage control, liquidity was injected at unprecedented scale. Emergency facilities multiplied. But the world was no longer listening. Liquidity cannot repair credibility. Printing money to cover default only confirmed fears. Internationally, the response was decisive. Trade partners demanded prepayment or non-dollar settlement. Strategic assets were repriced overnight. Defense commitments were questioned. Diplomatic leverage collapsed alongside financial power. Sanctions lost effectiveness when the issuing currency was no longer trusted. The reserve currency era was officially over. History recorded the moment quietly, not with explosions, but with spreadsheets. A missed payment. A restructured bond. A footnote that reshaped the world. Default did not mean the United States disappeared. It meant it became ordinary, another debtor nation negotiating terms. Another issuer whose promises required scrutiny. Another economy forced to live within constraints it had long ignored. For the dollar, the consequences were terminal. A currency backed by a defaulting sovereign does not recover trust quickly, if ever. Exchange rates collapsed. Domestic prices surged. The dollar's external value approached irrelevance. At home, the symbolism was devastating. The government that had once guaranteed everything could now guarantee nothing. The social contract, already fractured, shattered completely. Faith in institutions, monetary, political, legal, fell to historic lows. The announcement ended decades of denial. The dollar had not merely weakened, it had failed its ultimate test. And when the world's reserve currency defaults, the question is no longer about recovery, it is about what replaces it. When the dollar finally failed, there was no single day after no clean reset. No moment when everything stopped and restarted. There was only adjustment. In the weeks following the default, the economy did not disappear, but it changed shape. The old system, built on debt, credit, and trust in future repayment, was gone. What replaced it was fragmented, improvised, and deeply unequal. Money still existed. But it was no longer universal. Local solutions emerged first. Cities, counties, and even neighborhoods began issuing their own exchange systems, vouchers, credits, time-based currencies. A day of labor equaled a day of labor, regardless of profession. These systems were inefficient, but they were trusted because they were immediate and local. In the absence of stable national currency, proximity became value. Barter returned, not as nostalgia, but necessity. Skills mattered more than titles. Mechanics, farmers, electricians, and medical professionals became indispensable. Entire communities reorganized around what they could produce rather than what they could afford. Those with hard assets fared best. Gold, silver, tools, land, fuel, and stored goods functioned as real money. Not because they were perfect, but because they were scarce and useful. The idea of wealth shifted away from numbers and toward utility. For many, this was a brutal awakening. Decades of digital wealth vanished. Stock portfolios, retirement accounts, insurance policies, claims on a system that no longer functioned, became historical artifacts. Inequality reshuffled violently. Some fell fast. Others rose simply because they possessed something tangible. The federal government attempted reconstruction. A new monetary framework was proposed. Officials promised discipline, limits, transparency. But credibility was gone. Without trust, even sound policy sounded like fiction. Adoption was slow, fragmented, and conditional. International trade partially resumed, but on new terms. Imports were prepaid. Exports were exchanged for commodities or foreign currencies. The United States was no longer the buyer of last resort, it was a negotiator. Consumption fell sharply. Domestic production slowly returned, driven by necessity rather than efficiency. Living standards adjusted downward. Smaller homes. Fewer imports. Less waste. Life became more local, more manual, more uncertain. For some, this meant hardship. For others, it meant resilience. The economy shrank, but stabilized. Social bonds changed. Communities that cooperated survived. Those that fragmented did not. Trust moved from institutions to people. Reputation replaced credit scores. Long-term thinking returned, not because it was incentivized, but because it was required. A generation grew up without financial illusion. They did not believe money was neutral or permanent. They understood scarcity. They understood trade-offs. They did not expect the future to be financed. It had to be built. Globally, a new order emerged. No single currency replaced the dollar. Instead, a multipolar system took shape. Regional currencies. Commodity-backed trade. Digital settlement layers without sovereign dominance. Power dispersed. Stability increased. Slowly, history reframed the dollar. It was remembered not as evil, but as unsustainable. A system that worked brilliantly, until it didn't. The collapse was not caused by one policy or one leader, but by decades of postponed consequences. In retrospect, the signs were obvious: debt without limit, money without restraint, promises without accountability. The dollar did not go to zero because it lacked power. It went to zero because it demanded belief forever, and belief is not infinite. The end of the dollar was not the end of society. It was the end of pretending that numbers alone create value. What followed was harder, but it was real. History never shouts its lessons. It whispers them, again and again, until they are ignored no longer. The fall of the US dollar was not remembered as a single event, but as a long unraveling. There was no villain, no switch flipped in secret, no moment when collapse became inevitable overnight. Instead, there was complacency. Convenience. Confidence stretched too far. For too long, for decades, the dollar benefited from a unique privilege: it did not have to obey the same rules as other currencies. Demand was global. Debt was absorbable. Mistakes were forgiven. Each crisis reinforced the belief that the system was resilient, until resilience became dependency. What history recorded was not the failure of money, but the failure of restraint. The institutions meant to protect stability gradually shifted their purpose. The Federal Reserve had once existed to manage cycles. Over time, it was asked to eliminate them. Every downturn required intervention. Every intervention required expansion. The line between support and distortion disappeared. Politics followed the same path. Short-term comfort replaced long-term responsibility. Hard decisions were delayed. Promises multiplied. Accountability thinned. The future was continuously mortgaged to protect the present. And because the cost was invisible at first, it felt painless. Until it wasn't. The dollar's collapse forced a global reckoning. Nations relearned what reserve status truly means: not power, but discipline. Trust cannot be commanded. It must be earned repeatedly, especially when it is easiest to abuse. The world moved away from dependence on any single system, not out of hostility, but memory. Multipolarity was not ideology. It was insurance. For Americans, the lesson was more intimate: money had been mistaken for wealth. Credit for productivity. Consumption for prosperity. When those illusions disappeared, what remained was effort, cooperation, and limits. Painful, yes, but also clarifying. Communities that survived did not wait for rescue. They rebuilt locally. They prioritized usefulness over appearance. They rediscovered that value comes from creation, not issuance. The collapse reshaped generations. Those who lived through it carried permanent skepticism. They questioned easy money. They distrusted guarantees without limits. They understood that stability is not a permanent state, it is a process that must be maintained. Future policymakers studied the era closely, not to assign blame, but to recognize patterns. Unlimited debt. Suppressed risk. Moral hazard disguised as stability. Every great currency collapse in history shared these traits. The dollar was not exceptional, it was human. And that was the final lesson. No system outgrows responsibility. No currency outlasts trust. No shortcut avoids consequence forever. The dollar did not fall because people stopped believing in America. It fell because belief was asked to replace discipline. In the years that followed, new systems emerged, imperfect, constrained, cautious. Growth returned slowly, honestly. Stability was no longer assumed. It was protected, and history, having delivered its warning once again, waited patiently. Because it always does.